Clara Ashford pressed her dead father's Bible against her chest and walked through the door of the most terrifying house she had ever seen. 3 weeks since they'd put him in the ground. 3 weeks since everything she'd ever known crumbled into debt and silence. Her dress was still mourning black. Her pride was still raw as a fresh wound. And somewhere past those doors, a man waited who had already decided she was worth nothing more than the wage he'd agreed to pay. She walked in anyway. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had come on a Tuesday. Clara had been sitting at the edge of her father's bed, the bed they would soon have to sell along with the house, the horse, and the last 2 silver candlesticks her mother had left behind, when the neighbor's boy knocked on the door and handed her an envelope with a wax seal she didn't recognize. She'd read it twice before she understood it. Mr. Julian Hartwell of Hartwell Manor, Albemarle County, Virginia, requires the services of an educated woman of good character to serve as companion and instructress to his daughter, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, age 7. Room and board provided. Wage $6 monthly. Inquiries to be directed to Mr. Samuel Cobb, Land Agent, Main Street. $6 a month. It wasn't dignity. It wasn't what her father had raised her for. He'd raised her for music lessons and correspondence in French and conversations about philosophy over supper. He'd raised her like she mattered. But her father was gone, and mattering didn't put bread on a table. She'd written back that same afternoon. The road to Hartwell Manor took nearly 4 hours by hired cart, and the driver didn't say a word the entire time, which suited Clara fine. She had nothing to say either. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her Bible tucked into her traveling bag, and her eyes straight ahead. She did not let herself think about the bedroom she'd slept in every night of her life, now empty. She did not let herself think about the sound of her father's cough in the winter, or the way he used to hum while he read. She pressed all of it down into the bottom of her chest, and breathed slow and steady, the way he'd taught her. Grief is a private thing, Clara girl, he used to say. You carry it quiet, and you carry it proud. She intended to. The manor appeared through the tree line like a judgment. It was the largest private residence she had ever seen. 3 stories of pale Virginia brick, wide white columns across the front. The kind of house that said, without a single word, I do not need you. You need me. The grounds were immaculate. The fence lines were straight. Even the summer heat seemed to behave itself on this property like it had been instructed to. The cart stopped at the servants' entrance. Clara climbed down without help, smoothed her skirt, picked up her bag, and knocked. The housekeeper who answered was a stout woman in her 50s named Mrs. Beaumont, with gray threaded hair pinned flat and eyes that measured Clara in one sweep, like she was appraising cloth at a market. Miss Ashford, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. You're younger than I expected. I'm 23, Clara said. Old enough. Mrs. Beaumont made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite argument, and stepped aside to let her in. Mr. Hartwell will see you in the study. He doesn't like waiting. I'm not late, Clara said. No, Mrs. Beaumont said. But he doesn't like waiting even when you're not. Clara followed her through a back corridor past the kitchen, past a narrow staircase and into the main hall, marble floors. Dark wood paneling portraits on the walls of men who all shared the same sharp jaw and the same expression that said they had never once in their lives been told no. The air smelled of leather and beeswax and something cold underneath like stone that never quite caught the warmth. Mrs. Beaumont stopped in front of a closed door and knocked twice. Send her in, said a voice from inside. It was the kind of voice that did not raise itself. It didn't need to. Julian Hartwell was standing with his back to the door when Clara entered, looking out the window with his hands clasped behind him. He was taller than she expected. Lean and straight-spined, dressed in a dark coat and riding boots, his dark hair cut close. He didn't turn around immediately. He let her stand there in silence for what felt like a full minute, and Clara understood immediately that this was intentional. She didn't fidget. She didn't clear her throat. She waited. When he finally turned, his eyes went to her face first, then her dress, then back to her face. They were gray, his eyes. Not a warm gray. The kind of gray that belonged to November skies. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Mr. Hartwell. You came recommended by Reverend Aldous." "I did." "He described you as capable and clear-headed. He said it like those were unremarkable qualities. He also said your father passed recently." "6 weeks ago, sir." "And you find yourself in need of employment." "I find myself choosing employment," Clara said. "There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but close to it. He looked at her for a moment with more attention than he had before. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He moved to stand behind his desk, but didn't sit himself, which she recognized as a deliberate choice. He wanted to be above her for this conversation. "My daughter Eleanor is 7 years old," he said. "She lost her mother 2 years ago. She is—" He paused, and in that pause, Clara caught the first crack in his composure, just a hairline fracture quickly sealed. "She is struggling with her studies and with her conduct. She requires consistency and discipline." "What does she require besides those things?" Clara asked. He looked at her sharply. "I beg your pardon." "You told me what you need from her," Clara said. "I'm asking what she needs." The silence that followed was not comfortable. "She needs," Julian said slowly, as if choosing each word with deliberate care, "to grow into a young woman of character and composure. She needs to be educated appropriately. She does not need indulgence." "Every child needs some indulgence, Mr. Hartwell." "Miss Ashford." His voice dropped a register. "I have employed 3 women in this position in the past 2 years. Each of them had opinions about what my daughter needed. None of them are here any longer." 3 in 2 years, Clara said. "That's correct." "And you're certain the problem was the women?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Julian Hartwell looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected that has landed in his path, not angry yet, but calculating. "You are very direct," he said. "My father raised me that way. He said honesty was more useful than manners." "Your father," Julian said, "is no longer here to guide your employment prospects." It landed exactly as he'd intended it to, like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. Clara felt the pain of it move through her chest, felt her throat tighten. She did not look away. "No," she said. "He isn't, but his advice still stands." Julian studied her for another long moment. Then he moved around the desk and sat down finally, like a decision had been made. "The wage is $6 monthly," he said. "Your meals are taken with the household staff. You will have Sundays free after the morning service. Eleanor's lessons begin at 8 in the morning and continue until 2 in the afternoon. You will accompany her on afternoon walks. You will report her progress to me every Friday evening. And if I disagree with your instructions regarding her education, then you will keep that disagreement to yourself." Clara looked at him steadily. "I'll do my best," she said. He seemed to understand that wasn't a promise. "Mrs. Beaumont will show you to your room," he said. "You begin tomorrow." Eleanor Hartwell was not what Clara expected. She expected a frightened little girl, maybe withdrawn and teary, the kind of child grief had made small. Or she expected a spoiled child, the kind that rich fathers sometimes produced, when they didn't know what else to do with their guilt. What she found was a 7-year-old sitting in the middle of the nursery floor, surrounded by the wreckage of what appeared to be an entire porcelain tea set, holding a single, intact teacup like a trophy. "You broke it on purpose," Clara said. Eleanor looked up. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark curls. Clara could see the portrait of Margaret Hartwell in the hallway, and the resemblance was unmistakable. "How do you know I didn't drop it by accident?" "Because you're holding the only piece that isn't broken, like you were trying to save it," Clara said. If it had been an accident, you'd have tried to save all of them. Eleanor stared at her. "What's your name?" the girl asked. "Miss Ashford. You may call me Clara if your father permits it." "He won't," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't permit anything." "What happened to the tea set?" Eleanor set the cup down carefully on the floor in front of her. "Miss Harlow, the last one, said I wasn't allowed to have tea parties unless I finished my French recitation perfectly. I never finish it perfectly. So I decided if I couldn't have them anyway, neither could anyone else." Clara looked at the shattered porcelain. Then she sat down on the floor across from Eleanor, which was not at all what the girl expected. She could see that in the way Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "Well," Clara said, "that's a very logical conclusion. You're not going to scold me. I'm going to ask you one question first." Eleanor waited. "Did it help?" The girl looked at the broken pieces. Something moved across her small face. Something too old for 7. Something that had been living there for 2 years, wearing the shape of a child's anger. "No," she said quietly. "No." Clara agreed. "It never does." They sat there for a moment in the quiet. "My father is going to be very angry," Eleanor said. It wasn't a warning. It was just a statement of the way things were. "I expect so," Clara said. "But that's between him and me, not between him and you. Do you understand the difference?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "It means," Clara said, "that whatever happens next is mine to handle, not yours to worry about." Julian Hartwell appeared in the doorway of the nursery 7 minutes later, which told Clara that either Mrs. Beaumont had gone straight to him or he made a habit of checking on this room at certain hours. Neither possibility surprised her. He took in the scene, his daughter, the broken porcelain, Clara sitting on the floor, and his jaw tightened with a precision that made Clara think of a clock being wound. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, sir." The girl's voice had gone quiet and careful the way children's voices did around lightning. "Go to your room." Eleanor stepped carefully around the broken pieces, and left without looking at either of them. The door clicked shut behind her. Julian looked at Clara. "Get up off the floor." Clara rose unhurried and brushed her skirt smooth. "You've been in this house less than 12 hours, he said. "And my daughter has destroyed her tea set, and you are sitting on the nursery floor as though you are a guest at a garden party." "She needed someone to sit with her," Clara said. "So I sat." "You are not here to sit with her. You are here to educate her and to maintain order." "Order without trust isn't order," Clara said. "It's just fear with better furniture." "Miss Ashford." He said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. "I will remind you that you have been employed for less than 1 day. I can hire 50 women like you between now and next Tuesday." Clara looked at him directly. "Then do it," she said. The words fell into the silence between them like a stone into water. "I beg your pardon." His voice had gone very quiet. "If I'm that replaceable, Mr. Hartwell, then replace me," Clara said. "But before you do, consider that I'm the first one who sat with your daughter on the floor and the first one she looked at without flinching. That may not mean anything to you. It means something to her." She held his gaze. She did not look away. She felt her heart hammering hard against her ribs, felt the terror of it. $6 a month, no home to go back to, her father's voice in her head saying, "You carry it quiet, you carry it proud." And she stood there, and she did not flinch either. Julian Hartwell stared at her for a long, measured moment. "Clean this up," he said at last, gesturing to the broken porcelain. "And see to it that Eleanor is presentable for supper." He left. Clara let out a slow breath through her nose. Her hands were trembling slightly. She noticed that, and she pressed them flat against her skirt until they stopped. "All right," she said quietly to the empty room. She got down on her knees and began gathering the broken pieces. Supper in the Hartwell household was a formal affair, even with only 3 people at the table. Julian sat at the head. Eleanor sat at his right. Clara sat at the far end, which was technically the foot of the table, and which she suspected was not accidental. The silver was polished. The food was prepared by a cook who clearly had strong opinions about presentation. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes except to request the passing of dishes. Eleanor kept her eyes on her plate. Julian ate with the deliberate economy of a man who considered meals a necessity rather than a pleasure. Clara ate and watched them both and began to understand the particular shape of this silence. How old it was, how practiced, how neither of them had chosen it, but both had learned to live inside it like a house they hadn't meant to stay in. "Eleanor," she said, setting her fork down, "what is your favorite subject in your lessons?" Eleanor looked up, startled by the sudden sound of a voice. Julian looked up too, though his expression showed nothing. "I don't have one," Eleanor said carefully. "You don't like any of them." Miss Harlow said liking them wasn't the point. "Miss Harlow isn't here," Clara said. "I'm asking what you actually enjoy. Drawing reading sums." Eleanor glanced at her father. His face gave her nothing. She looked back at Clara. "Stories," she said very quietly. "I like when someone reads stories to me." "What kind of stories?" "The ones about people who have adventures." A pause. "The ones that end well." Clara nodded. "Then we'll start there." Julian set his fork down. "Miss Ashford." "Yes, sir." Eleanor's curriculum has been established. It includes French mathematics, penmanship, and household management. It does not include story time. Reading comprehension is an educational subject, Mr. Hartwell. Not in the manner you're describing. "The manner I'm describing," Clara said carefully, "is the manner that might convince a 7-year-old girl that learning is something that belongs to her rather than something that's done to her. But I understand your concern." Julian looked at her. "Do you?" "Yes, sir. You're concerned that kindness in education leads to weakness in character." "That is not—" He stopped. "I had a teacher once," Clara said, "who made me write 200 lines for laughing in class. I learned to stop laughing. I did not learn to love learning. My father, on the other hand, used to read me Homer at bedtime and quiz me on it at breakfast. I learned more from those breakfasts than from a year of lines." The table was very quiet. Eleanor was looking at Clara with the expression of someone watching a very dangerous and fascinating thing happen from a safe distance. Julian picked his fork back up. "We'll discuss the curriculum on Friday," he said. "As I told you." "Of course," Clara said. She picked up her own fork. Eleanor very quietly looked down at her plate, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. That night, Clara sat at the small desk in her room with her father's Bible open in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. She was listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of old timber, the distant sound of Julian Hartwell's study door opening and closing, the murmur of what she thought might be him speaking to his land agent about something she didn't understand yet and didn't need to. She thought about the look on Eleanor's face when she'd sat on the floor. She thought about the look on Julian's face when she'd said, "Then do it." She thought about the way grief lived differently in different people, how it made some people soft and some people stone, and how both were just different kinds of the same pain looking for somewhere to put itself. She closed the Bible and held it against her chest. $6 a month, she thought, and a child who likes stories that end well. There were worse reasons to stay. She blew out the candle and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling in the summer dark, and somewhere in the east wing of Hartwell Manor, a little girl with her mother's curls and her father's grief lay in her own bed and thought, perhaps for the first time in a long while, about a woman who had sat down on the floor beside her and asked if it helped. It hadn't. But somehow that honesty had. The first week passed like a slow negotiation. Clara learned the rhythms of Hartwell Manor, the way you learn a difficult piece of music not by forcing it, but by listening until the patterns revealed themselves. Mrs. Beaumont ran the household with the quiet authority of a woman who had long ago decided that efficiency was more important than warmth. But she was not unkind. She left a pot of tea outside Clara's door each morning without being asked. And once, when Clara came downstairs before dawn because she couldn't sleep, she found the older woman already in the kitchen and neither of them spoke. But Mrs. Beaumont pushed a cup across the table without looking up, and that felt like a kind of welcome. The cook was named Dottie, and she had opinions about everything and kept most of them to herself, except when she didn't. The stableman, a quiet man named George, tipped his hat at Clara every morning with a sincerity that she found unexpectedly steadying. And Eleanor was a knot that Clara untied slowly, one thread at a time. The girl was brilliant. That was the first thing Clara understood about her. Sharp and quick and starving for engagement, the kind of child who didn't need easier lessons, but better ones. Miss Harlow and the two women before her, whose names Clara pieced together from overheard conversations, had treated Eleanor like a problem to be managed. They had given her rote recitation and firm correction, and very little else, and Eleanor had responded the way any starved thing responds when you offer it nothing but rules she had started biting. Clara didn't offer her rules, she offered her stories. On the third morning she arrived in the nursery carrying a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, and set it on the table between them. Eleanor looked at it suspiciously. "Father didn't approve this." "Your father approved reading comprehension," Clara said, opening to the first chapter. "This is reading comprehension. He'll be angry." "Probably," Clara agreed. "Read the first paragraph aloud for me." Eleanor read it, haltingly at first, then with increasing speed. Then she stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked up. "He's alone on the island. Completely. And he has to figure out how to survive by himself. Everything. Shelter, food, fire, all of it." Eleanor looked back at the page. "Read more," she said. By the end of that first week, Eleanor had stopped breaking things. Clara noticed this on Friday afternoon, and felt it the way you feel a headache lifting slowly, and then all at once. The girl still had a temper. She still went rigid and silent sometimes in a way that Clara recognized as grief wearing the mask of stubbornness. But she had stopped destroying what she couldn't control. That Friday evening, Clara went to Julian's study as instructed. He was behind his desk with papers spread in front of him, and he looked up when she knocked and said, "Come," without any particular warmth. Clara sat in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap and waited. "Your report," he said. "Eleanor is reading above her level," Clara said. "Her French accent is poor, but her comprehension is strong. Her mathematics are inconsistent. She understands the concepts, but loses patience with the process. Her penmanship needs work, but she doesn't resist it the way she resists other things. And her conduct, improving." Julian looked up from the notes he'd been making. "That's a vague answer." "She hasn't broken anything in 4 days," Clara said. "For a child in her situation, that's not vague. That's significant." "Her situation," he repeated, and there was something careful in his voice. Something that was either a warning or a door held slightly open. Clara couldn't tell which. "She's grieving Mr. Hartwell," Clara said. "She's been grieving for 2 years, and no one has given her a language for it." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "I am aware," Julian said slowly, "that Eleanor lost her mother." "I know you are," Clara said. "I'm saying she needs to talk about it. Not just manage it. Talk about it. She is 7 years old. 7-year-olds understand loss better than we give them credit for. They just need someone willing to sit with them in it." Julian set his pen down. He looked at her with those November gray eyes, and Clara saw something move through them, something quick and carefully controlled, like a fish seen through deep water. "That will be all, Miss Ashford," he said. Clara stood. "Yes, sir." She was at the door when he said without looking up from his papers, "You were using Robinson Crusoe in her lessons this week." Clara stopped. She didn't turn around. "Yes, sir." "Mrs. Beaumont mentioned it." Of course she did, Clara said, and she kept her voice neutral. That text was not part of the established curriculum. No, sir. I will not have my instructions circumvented, Miss Ashford. Am I clear? Clara turned then. She looked at him directly. Mr. Hartwell. In the 4 days since I started reading Robinson Crusoe with Eleanor, she has asked me 14 questions about survival resourcefulness and what a person does when they have nothing left and have to start over. Every single one of those questions was really about her mother. Every single one. Julian said nothing. You tell me, Clara said, whether that's a circumvention or an education. She left before he could answer. She expected to be called back. She expected a formal reprimand, or worse, the polite clipped dismissal she had heard about from Mrs. Beaumont in low tones, the way Mr. Hartwell had let go of the previous 3 women in language so correct and cold that you almost didn't realize you'd been cut until you were already bleeding. The summons never came. On Saturday morning, Clara found a note on the nursery table in Julian Hartwell's precise angular handwriting. It said only, "Continue with the Defoe." H. She stood there with the note in her hand for a long moment. Then she set it down, smoothed it flat, and went to find Eleanor. The trouble came on a Tuesday. Clara should have anticipated it looking back. She could see every step that led to it. But at the time, it arrived with the speed and force of something she hadn't braced for. She and Eleanor had been working through a mathematics lesson, and Eleanor had gotten stuck on a long division problem and frustrated, and Clara had been guiding her through it with patience, and they had been at the table together for 20 minutes when the door opened without a knock. The woman who entered was perhaps 40, dressed well, with the kind of beauty that had once been striking and had sharpened with age into something more like precision. She carried herself the way women carry themselves when they are accustomed to entering rooms and having those rooms rearrange themselves around them. "You must be the new one," the woman said, looking at Clara the way you look at furniture you're considering moving. Eleanor had gone very still. "I'm Miss Ashford," Clara said, rising from her chair. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Mrs. Cecile Drayton." The woman moved into the room without being invited to, glancing at the papers on the table with mild distaste. "I'm Julian's cousin. I come every summer to help manage the household. This year, evidently, there's been a change in the domestic arrangements." Her eyes moved to Eleanor. "Come kiss me, child." Eleanor stood and went to her aunt and presented her cheek and received a kiss that seemed more obligation than affection on both sides. And then she came back to her chair and sat down with her hands in her lap and said nothing. "I was told you've been here 2 weeks," Mrs. Drayton said to Clara. 10 days, Clara said. 10 days. Mrs. Drayton smiled. "A record, actually. The last one only lasted 9. Clara said nothing. "Julian is terribly difficult," Mrs. Drayton said, settling herself into the chair by the window with the ease of a woman in her own house. "I expect you've discovered that by now. He's not a cruel man, I want to be clear about that, but he has absolutely no capacity for anything that doesn't fit inside the lines he's drawn for himself. His wife's death." She paused, glanced at Eleanor, and lowered her voice with the particular adult thoughtlessness of people who believe children don't hear what they can clearly hear. "Margaret's death rather finished him. He hasn't been the same since." "Mrs. Drayton," Clara said, "we're in the middle of a lesson." "Of course." Mrs. Drayton stood with graceful unhurry. "I'll see you at supper. Julian will want to introduce us properly." At the door she turned back, and her voice was still pleasant, but the pleasantness now had an edge under it, like a blade under silk. "A word of advice, Miss Ashford. Don't make the mistake of thinking that because Eleanor has taken to you, you have any security here. Julian's regard is not Eleanor's regard, and his decisions are his alone." She left. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was staring at the mathematics problem in front of her with the expression of someone who was not seeing it at all. "Eleanor," Clara said quietly. "She's not wrong," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat and careful. "He'll send you away. They all go away." Clara sat down. "Not today," she said. Eleanor looked up. "You don't know that." "No," Clara said. "I don't. But today I'm here. And today this long division problem still needs solving." She tapped the paper. "Show me where you got stuck." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, that 7-year-old face, carrying 2 years' worth of everyone who had sat in this chair and then left. Then she picked up her pencil. "Here," she said, pointing at the third step. "I don't understand what to do with the remainder." "All right," Clara said. "Let's figure it out together." Supper that night was a different animal entirely. Mrs. Drayton talked with the easy authority of someone performing for an audience of one, which was Julian, who ate in his customary silence, but occasionally responded to her with 2 or 3 words that she received like gifts and expanded into entire paragraphs. Clara watched them and understood something about the geography of this household, how Cecile Drayton occupied a specific space in it, a space that was not quite family and not quite guest, a space shaped by history and convenience, and something Clara couldn't quite name yet. "Miss Ashford comes from Charlottesville," Mrs. Drayton said at one point, as though Clara were not sitting directly across from her. "Her father was a schoolteacher." "He was," Clara said, "and he left her well provided for." It was asked with the lightness of a woman who already knew the answer and was watching to see how you'd carry the weight of it. "He left me educated," Clara said, "which is more than most people leave their daughters." Julian looked up from his plate. "Well said," he said, and then looked back down. Mrs. Drayton's smile held perfectly, but something behind it shifted. Clara noted this and filed it away. The second twist arrived 3 days later, and it hit harder than the first. Mrs. Beaumont came to the nursery door mid-morning with a look on her face that Clara had not seen before, controlled carefully blank in a way that meant the opposite of blank. "Mr. Hartwell wants to see you," she said. "Now." Clara set down the book she and Eleanor had been sharing and met Eleanor's eyes. The girl had gone still in that particular way again. "Keep reading," Clara told her. "I'll be back." She followed Mrs. Beaumont down the hall and up the stairs to Julian's private study on the 2nd floor. Not the formal study on the ground floor where he received her on Fridays, but his personal one, the one she had never been to before. The door was already open. Julian was standing by the window, which Clara was beginning to understand was what he did when a conversation was going to be difficult. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Mrs. Drayton spoke to me this morning," he said without turning. "She told me she observed your lesson on Tuesday." "Yes, sir." She said Eleanor was reading a novel that was not part of her approved curriculum. "We finished Robinson Crusoe on Saturday," Clara said. "We've started A Lady's Life in Virginia, which is a historical account with significant educational merit." She also said. Julian continued, his voice quieter. Now, and quieter was worse. Clara was learning. Quieter meant the really serious things that she heard you tell Eleanor, and I want to be precise about the wording she used. She heard you tell my daughter that grief is something you talk about, that you should speak it out loud. "Yes," Clara said. "I said that." Julian turned from the window. His face was controlled, but it was the control of a man holding something under tremendous pressure. She could see it in the line of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, both too deliberate. "My daughter," he said, "is not your patient, Miss Ashford. She is not a project. She is a child who requires education and structure, and you are here to provide those things, not to—" "She cried on Wednesday," Clara said. He stopped. "After her lesson," Clara said. "I was reading to her, and she started crying. Not hysterical, quietly. She was crying because the character in the book had lost someone, and it reminded her of her mother, and she let herself feel it for about 3 minutes, and then she wiped her face and said, 'I think Mama would have liked this story.' And then she asked if we could keep reading." Clara paused. That was the first time she has mentioned her mother voluntarily since I arrived. Mrs. Beaumont told me she hadn't spoken her mother's name to anyone in the house in over a year. The silence was very long. Julian's hands were no longer still. The right one had moved to the desk and pressed flat against the surface, fingers spread like he was steadying himself. "Mrs. Drayton means well," he said finally, and his voice was different now, rougher at the edges, like stone worn by water. "She has been a support to this family. Her advice on Eleanor's upbringing has been—" "She told Eleanor not to get attached to me," Clara said. He looked at her sharply. "She didn't say it directly," Clara said. "She said it the way adults say things to children when they think children aren't really listening. She said everyone leaves. She said it in a room where your daughter was sitting 3 feet away, Mr. Hartwell." The muscle in Julian's jaw moved. "Eleanor told me," Clara said. "She said Aunt Cecile says they all go away. And then she asked me if I was going to go away." Clara let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "I want to know what you want me to say to her when she asks me that." Julian looked at her, really looked at her the way he almost never did. Not the measuring look he used in the formal study, not the cold assessment he deployed when she challenged him. This was something else. This was a man standing at the edge of something and not quite able to see the bottom. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "She's 7 years old," Clara said. "And she has already lost the one person she was most certain of. Every time someone walks out that door, she loses her again. Every time." She paused. "I'm not asking you for promises. I'm asking you to understand what's at stake for her every single morning when she sits down at that table and picks up her pencil." The clock on the mantel ticked. Julian turned back to the window. "You may return to your lessons," he said. "Yes, sir." She was halfway to the door when he spoke again, and she would think about this moment later alone in her room for a long time. "Miss Ashford," he said. She stopped. "When she asked you if you were going to leave, what did you tell her?" Clara kept her hand on the doorframe. "I told her that was a question for her father," she said. "Because it is." She left him standing at the window, and when she came back to the nursery, Eleanor was sitting at the table with the book open and her finger tracing a line on the page, and she looked up when Clara came in, and in her gray eyes, her father's gray eyes, there was a question that neither of them put into words. Clara sat down. "Where were we?" she said. Eleanor found the page. "Here," she said. "She's deciding whether to stay." Clara looked at the line Eleanor's finger was resting on. She could have left. The road was open, the morning was clear, and no one would have thought less of her for going. But she had made a promise not out loud, not in any language anyone else could have heard, and that kind of promise she had learned was the hardest kind to break. Clara read it. Then she looked up at Eleanor. "Keep going," she said. 3 days after Clara returned to the nursery and told Eleanor to keep reading. Mrs. Drayton made her move. It wasn't loud. Women like Cecile Drayton didn't make loud moves. They made precise ones, the kind you don't see coming until you're already looking at the damage. Clara understood this the way you understand weather, not because anyone warned her, but because she had learned to read the air. It started with small things. The tea outside her door stopped appearing. At meals, Mrs. Drayton addressed Clara with a particular kind of excessive politeness, the kind that had teeth underneath, and Julian watched these exchanges with his customary silence, which Clara could no longer read as neutrally as she once had. And Eleanor, who had been opening up like a fist slowly releasing, went quiet again. Not broken tea set quiet. Watchful quiet. The kind a child goes when she has learned that the people around her are arranging something that involves her, and she has not been asked. Clara noticed all of it. She said nothing. She kept teaching. On Thursday morning, she arrived in the nursery to find it empty. Eleanor's books were on the table. Her pencil was set down carefully, like she'd just stepped away. But the chair was pushed back at an angle that wasn't Eleanor's habit. The girl always pushed her chair in straight, and Clara stood in the doorway and felt something cold move through her chest. She went to find Mrs. Beaumont. She found her in the linen room, folding sheets with the methodical concentration of a woman who was deliberately not thinking about something. "Where is Eleanor?" Clara asked. Mrs. Beaumont didn't look up. "Mrs. Drayton took her for a walk this morning. She's supposed to be in lessons." Mrs. Drayton spoke to Mr. Hartwell. A pause. "Apparently, Eleanor's schedule has been adjusted." Clara stood very still. "Adjusted how?" "Morning lessons will be reduced to 1 hour." Mrs. Beaumont set a folded sheet down and finally looked at Clara. Her expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a woman delivering news she wishes she didn't have. "Afternoons will be supervised by Mrs. Drayton going forward. Social instruction, she called it." "Social instruction," Clara repeated. "I know," Mrs. Beaumont said quietly. "He agreed to this. He signed off on it this morning, yes." Clara didn't say anything. She turned and walked back down the hall, and her footsteps were very quiet on the floorboards, because she was concentrating on making them quiet, because the alternative was something louder and harder, and she was not ready for that yet. She went back to the nursery and sat down in Eleanor's chair and looked at the pencil the girl had left on the table, and she thought about the look on Eleanor's face 3 days ago. She's deciding whether to stay, and she made a decision. She went to Julian's study at noon without an appointment. She knocked once and opened the door before he said, "Come in," which she had never done before, and the look on his face when he saw her told her that he knew it too. "Miss Ashford," he said, setting down his pen. "I don't recall scheduling." "You reduced Eleanor's lessons," Clara said. She closed the door behind her. "You gave her afternoons to your cousin." "I restructured Eleanor's schedule, yes." "You did it the morning after I told you she finally said her mother's name out loud." Clara moved to stand directly in front of his desk. "You did it 3 days after I told you what was at stake for her." "I want to understand if that timing is a coincidence, Mr. Hartwell, because I find I am having trouble believing that it is." Julian looked at her. His expression was the controlled one, the iron one, but underneath it she could see the same thing she'd seen at the window 2 days ago. That pressure that held down weight. "Mrs. Drayton has considerably more experience with the social development of young women than—" "Mrs. Drayton told your daughter that everyone leaves," Clara said. "She told her that in front of me in the room where Eleanor does her lessons, and she said it without flinching. That is the woman you've handed Eleanor's afternoons to." "You're overreacting." "Am I?" Clara put both hands flat on the surface of his desk. Not threatening, not dramatic, just direct the way her father had been. Direct the way she had been trying and failing to be direct with this man for 2 weeks. "Mr. Hartwell, Julian." She used his name and she watched him react to it, a small tightening, a flicker. "Your daughter is not difficult. She is not a problem to be managed. She is a child who lost her mother and has spent 2 years being handed from one woman to the next, while the one person she needs most sits in this room and signs paperwork, and will not sit with her in the grief." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian had gone very still. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, and his voice was rough in a way she hadn't heard before. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Clara said. "Because I buried my father 6 weeks ago, and I know what it looks like to carry grief alone. And I know what it feels like to have someone sit with you in it, and I know the difference between the two." She paused. "Eleanor needs you, Mr. Hartwell. Not another instructress. Not her Aunt Cecile. You. And every day you spend behind this door is a day she learns that love is something that goes away." Julian stood up from his chair. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, and the room felt smaller suddenly, and Clara held her ground and didn't step back. "You have been in this house for 2 weeks," he said, each word deliberate and precise. "You are an employee, a well-intentioned one perhaps, but you do not have the standing to speak to me about my relationship with my daughter or my grief or anything else that does not pertain directly to the academic education you were hired to provide." "Then fire me," Clara said. "I can hire 50? I know," she said. "You've said it. Do it." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that later. "But before you bring the next woman into this house and sit her down across from Eleanor and tell her to maintain order and consistency, ask yourself one question. Ask yourself why 3 women left in 2 years. Because I don't think it was because they weren't capable, Mr. Hartwell. I think it was because they could see that no matter how good they were at their jobs, they couldn't be what Eleanor actually needed, and eventually they couldn't bear it anymore." Julian's jaw was tight. He looked at her with something that had moved past controlled anger into something rawer. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. Clara waited. "My wife," he said again, quieter, "died in this house, in the room above this one. Eleanor was in the garden." He pressed his hand flat on the desk between them, and Clara recognized the gesture now she had seen it in the study upstairs, the same deliberate steadying. "I told Eleanor her mother was resting. I told her for 2 days. I didn't know how to—" He stopped again. His throat moved. "She found out from a house servant. She was 5 years old, and she found out because I didn't, because I couldn't." He didn't finish the sentence. Clara's chest ached with the plain human weight of it. "She blames herself," Clara said softly. "Eleanor does. She thinks if she had been better, quieter, more obedient, you wouldn't have sent her out to the garden that day." Julian looked at her sharply. "I never said—" "Children don't need to be told," Clara said. "They fill the silences with whatever makes the most sense to them. And the thing that makes most sense to a 5-year-old is that it must somehow be her fault." The clock on the mantel ticked. Julian sat back down. He sat down heavily the way a man sits when something has gone out of his legs. "She told you this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Not in words," Clara said. "But yes." The silence held for a long moment. Then Julian lifted his hand and pressed it over his mouth, and that gesture, so private, so unguarded, was more than anything else he had shown her in 2 weeks. "Restore her afternoons," Clara said. "Please." He looked at her over his hand. "And come to her lessons on Friday," she said. "Not to check my work. Just come. Sit in the room. Let her see you there." He said nothing to either request. Clara left his study and walked back to the nursery and sat down and picked up Eleanor's pencil and turned it in her fingers and told herself she had done what she could do. 20 minutes later, Eleanor came back from her walk with Mrs. Drayton. Her cheeks were flushed from the summer heat, and she was holding a small bunch of wildflowers that she'd apparently been told to pick, and she looked at Clara with eyes that asked a dozen questions at once. "Sit down," Clara said. "We've lost the morning, but we have the afternoon." Aunt Cecile said, "Your aunt says a great many things," Clara said gently. "Right now I'm saying we have the afternoon, and Robinson Crusoe is still waiting. And you promised me last week you were going to tell me what you thought Crusoe should have done differently when he first arrived on the island." Eleanor put the wildflowers in the water glass on the windowsill, the same glass they used for painting, and sat down. "He should have looked for fresh water first," she said, "before he did anything else, because without water nothing else matters." "That's exactly right," Clara said. And she meant it on every level there was to mean it. The second blow came the next morning. Clara heard it before she saw it. Voices in the front hall. One of them, Julian's, controlled and clipped, and one of them, she didn't recognize a man's voice, confident and carrying the particular tone of someone who considers himself welcome everywhere he goes. She would have stayed out of it. She had no reason to be in the front hall at 8 in the morning. She was on her way to the kitchen for Eleanor's breakfast tray, nothing more. But she heard her name. "The instructress, what do you know about her?" She stopped. "Her references are in order," Julian said. "Her references are from a country reverend and a dead man." The other voice said pleasantly, "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Cecile says she's been overstepping considerably. Cecile's assessments are not always. She says the woman has been filling Eleanor's head with ideas about grief and expression and all manner of things that aren't appropriate for a child of Eleanor's position. She says she's been undermining your authority in your own household. Cecile exaggerates. A pause. Does she? Because from where I'm standing, Julian, you've had 4 instructresses in 2 years, and Cecile tells me this one has been in your study 3 times in 2 weeks for conversations that go well beyond a progress report. Clara pressed herself against the wall of the corridor and did not breathe. She's effective with Eleanor, Julian said, and the evenness in his voice was a different kind of evenness than she had heard from him before. Defensive evenness, the kind you hear in a man who has already made up his mind about something and is tired of justifying it. I'm sure she is, the other man said, but effective and appropriate are 2 different measures, and in your position. In my position, Julian said, and his voice had dropped. Eleanor is my daughter, not the county's, not yours, mine. Another pause. There's talk, Julian, the other man said, quieter now. There's always talk. Talk with teeth this time. If you intend to keep this woman on, you will need to be considerably more careful about the appearance of things. Cecile is not the only one who has noticed. Clara heard footsteps, and she moved fast and silent back the way she had come, and she made it to the kitchen doorway before she heard the front hall go quiet. She stood with her back against the kitchen wall and breathed. Talk with teeth. She knew what that meant. In 1818 in Albemarle County, Virginia, a single woman of no particular family living under a wealthy widower's roof under whatever cloud of whatever rumor that was, not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that followed a woman. She thought about her father's voice. You carry it quiet, you carry it proud. She thought about Eleanor's face. She went and got the breakfast tray and took it upstairs. Friday came the way inevitable things come, slower than you want and faster than you're ready for. Clara's lessons with Eleanor that morning were the best they had ever been. Something had shifted in Eleanor over the past week, a steadiness, like the girl had been a boat rocking in uncertain water, and had finally found something to tie herself to. She was quicker, more engaged, less guarded. She laughed twice, actual clear laughter, the kind that sounded surprised by itself. At 10:30, the study door opened. Clara had her back to it. She heard it, and she felt Eleanor go still across the table, and she turned. Julian Hartwell was standing in the doorway of the nursery. He was in his riding clothes, which meant he'd come from outside, and he had clearly not planned this. Or if he had planned it, he'd been fighting the plan all morning, which showed in the slight rigidity of his posture, the way he stood like a man who has walked through a door and is not entirely sure why. Good morning, Clara said. Miss Ashford. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor. Good morning, Papa. Eleanor's voice was careful, but her hands were loose on the table, not clenched, not braced. A small thing that meant everything. Julian stepped into the room. He looked at the books on the table. He looked at Eleanor's neat pages of notes, her careful handwriting, the small pressed wildflower she'd slipped between the pages of Robinson Crusoe as a bookmark. What are you working on? He said. It came out as a statement. The habit of a man relearning how to ask questions. Long division, Eleanor said, and Crusoe. A pause. He's building a fence. Julian looked at the page she pointed to. Why a fence? So he knows what's his, Eleanor said. So he can tell the difference between safe and not safe. Julian looked at his daughter for a moment in silence. Clara did not move. She barely breathed. May I sit? Julian said. Eleanor looked at the chair beside her, Clara's usual chair, and then at Clara, who gave the smallest nod. Yes, Eleanor said. Julian sat down. He sat down beside his daughter at the nursery table in the chair where Clara had been sitting, and Eleanor looked at him with those gray eyes that were so much like his, and the room held very still around them. Show me the fence, Julian said. Eleanor turned the book toward him and pointed, and began to explain haltingly at first, and then with more confidence what Crusoe was doing and why. Clara moved to the window and stood there, and looked out at nothing in particular, and felt something in her chest that she couldn't have named and didn't try to. Behind her, she heard Eleanor's voice growing steadier and more animated, and she heard Julian respond not in the clipped authoritative tones he used everywhere else, but in something quieter, something that had the first tentative notes of the voice a father uses when he is remembering slowly who he meant to be. "Does it work?" Julian asked. "The fence." "Not the first time," Eleanor said. "He has to rebuild it." A pause. "He has to keep trying." Clara kept her eyes on the window. She heard Julian say, "Yes," very quietly. "I expect he does." And then Mrs. Drayton opened the nursery door without knocking. She took in the scene Julian sitting at the table with Eleanor Clara by the window, and her expression moved through surprise into something that was very carefully recalibrated into pleasantness before it fully arrived on her face. But Clara saw the instant before the calibration. She saw the surprise, and she saw what was underneath it. "Julian, Mrs." Drayton said warmly. "I didn't expect to find you here." "Clearly," Julian said. He did not stand up. "I was just coming to collect Eleanor for—" "Eleanor is in her lesson," Julian said. A beat of silence. "Of course," Mrs. Drayton said, her voice still smooth. "I'll come back." Her eyes moved to Clara, and in them was something that had stopped pretending to be polite. "Miss Ashford." "Mrs. Drayton," Clara said. The door closed. The room was quiet again. Eleanor was looking at her father. Julian was looking at the book. Then he turned the page and said, "Tell me about the next part. What does Crusoe do after the fence?" And Eleanor told him. And Clara stood at the window with the summer light coming through the glass, and she understood with the clarity of something that has been building for weeks, finally arriving, that whatever happened next, something had changed in this house that was not going to change back. She just didn't know yet whether that was the beginning of something or the end. Mrs. Drayton did not come back that afternoon. She did not come to supper either, which was unusual enough that even Dottie noticed Clara heard her mutter something to George about it when she passed the kitchen doorway. The empty chair at the table sat between Julian and Clara like a held breath, and Julian did not acknowledge it, and Clara did not mention it, and Eleanor ate her supper with the quiet alertness of a child who has learned to read silences the way other children read primers. "Crusoe finishes the fence tomorrow," Eleanor said, addressing neither of them in particular. "Does he?" Julian said. "Clara says when you finish building a thing, you have to decide whether to stay inside it or keep going." Eleanor picked up her fork. "I think he should keep going." Julian looked at Clara across the table. Clara looked at her plate. "That seems wise," Julian said, and his voice had the careful quality of a man testing new ground underfoot. Mrs. Drayton appeared the next morning at breakfast with the pleasant expression of a woman who has spent the night deciding something and arrived at peace with her decision. She sat down, poured her tea, and said without preamble, "I've been thinking about the autumn." Julian looked up. "I believe I'll stay through October this year," Mrs. Drayton said. "Eleanor needs consistency, and with the changes in her schedule—" "Eleanor's schedule hasn't changed," Julian said. Mrs. Drayton paused with her cup halfway to her mouth. "I thought we discussed—" "We discussed it," Julian said. "I've reconsidered. Miss Ashford will retain full morning and afternoon supervision of Eleanor's education. Your visits are always welcome, Cecile, but they won't be structured into Eleanor's daily routine." The cup went down very carefully. "I see," Mrs. Drayton said. "I thought you would," Julian said. Clara kept her eyes on her breakfast. Beside her she felt Eleanor go very still, and then very slowly release like a fist opening finger by finger. Mrs. Drayton looked at Clara with a smile that did not reach her eyes by a considerable distance. "Well," she said pleasantly, "Miss Ashford does seem to have made herself indispensable." "She has done her job," Julian said, And the plainness of it, no warmth, no elaboration, just the flat truth of it, was more than Clara had expected from him, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest, with unexpected force. The problem was that doing her job was no longer the only thing at stake. Clara knew this. She had known it since the morning she stood in the corridor and heard the word talk and understood what it meant. She had known it, and she had set it aside and kept working and kept telling herself it was manageable, and none of that had been entirely true. It came to a head on Sunday. The morning service was at the small white church 2 miles from the manor, and the Hartwell household attended in the family carriage, Julian and Eleanor in the forward-facing seats. Clara across from them, Mrs. Drayton beside her with a hat that communicated her feelings about the arrangement without a single word. It was a fine morning. The summer was beginning its slow lean toward August, the heat a little less sharp, the light a little longer in the evenings. Clara had been to this church 3 times since her arrival. She knew the Reverend, a decent man named Aldous, the same Reverend Aldous who had recommended her to Julian, who greeted her each week with the particular warmth of a man keeping an eye on an experiment he hoped would succeed. What she had not anticipated was the woman who stopped her after the service. Her name was Mrs. Pendleton. Clara knew this because Mrs. Beaumont had mentioned her twice in the tone reserved for people who require mentioning. She was the wife of the county magistrate, 45, and formidable, with the kind of social authority that came not from wealth, but from the accumulated weight of being right about people for a very long time. She took Clara's arm at the church door with the light, firm grip of a woman who has decided to have a conversation and will have it regardless. "Miss Ashford," she said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "I hope some of it's been kind," Clara said. "Some of it," Mrs. Pendleton said. "Walk with me a moment." They moved away from the carriage, away from Julian, who was speaking with the Reverend, away from Mrs. Drayton, who was watching them from 20 feet away with an expression Clara could feel on her back like a hand. "You understand your situation," Mrs. Pendleton said. It was not a question. "I understand my position," Clara said. "I'm not certain they're the same thing." "No," Mrs. Pendleton said. "They aren't." She stopped walking and looked at Clara directly. "There are people in this county who have decided to have an opinion about a young woman of no family living in Julian Hartwell's house. You've been here nearly a month. The Reverend vouches for your character. I have my own eyes. But character and appearances are different currencies, and in Albemarle County, appearances spend faster." Clara looked at her steadily. "What would you have me do?" "I would have you be careful," Mrs. Pendleton said. "And I would have you know that Cecile Drayton has been speaking to people, specifically to my husband." She paused. "Specifically about the nature of your influence over Mr. Hartwell's household." The words were careful. The meaning underneath them was not. "She's trying to have me dismissed," Clara said. "She's trying to have you removed in a way that makes it difficult for you to find similar employment afterward," Mrs. Pendleton said. "That's a more precise description of the thing." She looked at Clara with those measuring eyes. "Is there anything that would give her ammunition?" Clara thought about the study, about the conversations, about Julian's hand flat on the desk and his voice going rough, and the way he had said "my wife" and then stopped. "No," she said. "Then hold your ground," Mrs. Pendleton said. "But hold it quietly, and hold it correctly, and don't give that woman a single thread to pull." Julian was waiting by the carriage when Clara returned. He looked at her with a question in his eyes that he did not ask out loud. "Mrs. Pendleton is a sensible woman," Clara said, which answered nothing and everything. Julian held the carriage door for her. It was the first time he had done this. Clara stepped up without remarking on it, and he followed, and Mrs. Drayton was helped in by George, and Eleanor sat between them all with her Sunday gloves folded in her lap, and her eyes moving from one adult face to another with the quiet, exhausting attention of a child who has learned to monitor weather patterns in the people around her. On the drive back, Eleanor fell asleep against Clara's arm. It happened gradually and then completely, the way children sleep, the heaviness of her head, a warm, solid, trusting weight. Clara did not move. Julian watched his daughter sleep. He watched her for a long time. And then he looked at Clara, at the way Clara sat very still to keep from waking Eleanor, at the way Clara's hand had moved without thought to rest lightly on the girl's shoulder, and something moved through his face that was too complicated to name and gone too quickly to catch. The twist that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks into Clara's employment, and it did not knock. She was in the nursery alone. Eleanor had a minor fever and was resting in her room, which Clara had insisted on over Mrs. Drayton's suggestion that fresh air would do more good. A disagreement that had ended with Julian saying quietly, "And finally, she'll rest," when Mrs. Beaumont came to the door with an envelope. "This came this morning," she said. "It's addressed to Mr. Hartwell, but—" she stopped. "But what?" Clara said. Mrs. Beaumont pressed her lips together. "I read the name on the return correspondence before I thought better of it." She held out the envelope. "It's from a Mr. Alderton, of Richmond." Clara knew that name. She didn't know why she knew it, and then she did. She had heard it in the corridor that morning 3 weeks ago. The man Julian had spoken to, the confident voice, talk with teeth. "He reads his correspondence in the study," Clara said. "Clara, he's ridden out this morning," Mrs. Beaumont said. "He won't be back until late afternoon." She set the envelope on the table. "I thought you should know it arrived." She left without further explanation, and Clara looked at the envelope and understood that Mrs. Beaumont was in her own way trying to prepare her for something. She did not open it. She was not that woman, but she felt the weight of it sitting on the table the entire rest of the morning like a stone in a shoe. Julian returned at 4. He was in the study for 20 minutes before he sent for Clara. She came in and he was standing at the window. Of course he was with the letter open in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. Not the controlled anger, not the defended grief. Something that looked almost like a man who has been caught doing something he didn't know he was doing. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He turned from the window. He set the letter down on the desk facing her, and she looked at it without touching it. It was not long. It was politely worded with the particular politeness of men who have known each other a long time and have decided honesty between them is efficient. It said in 3 careful paragraphs that there was talk, that the talk had reached Richmond, that the nature of the talk concerned Julian's judgment, his household management, and the question of whether a man in his position, his specific position, there were words there about the estate, about the interests of certain business partners could afford, continued association with an arrangement that invited speculation. It suggested in its final paragraph that the current domestic arrangement be reconsidered before the autumn session of the county court, at which Julian had business pending that required the goodwill of certain parties. Clara read it. She looked up. "Cecile," she said. "I don't know that for certain," Julian said. "Don't you?" He looked at her. He sat down in his chair, which he did when things were decided she had learned. He sat down, and he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him think, which was something she had learned to recognize the particular quality of his silence when something real was happening inside it. "This is my fault," he said. Clara was quiet. "I knew the arrangement was. I knew there would be talk. I knew it from the beginning." He picked up the letter and set it down again. "I prioritized Eleanor's needs above the appearance of things, and I should have been more careful about—" "Don't," Clara said. He looked at her. "Don't apologize for prioritizing Eleanor," she said. "Don't make that the mistake. If you do that, the lesson you teach yourself is that she should come second, and then you will teach her that too." The clock ticked. Julian looked at her with the full force of those gray eyes, and in them there was something that had been building for 3 weeks, something that had been accumulating in every study conversation, every supper, every Friday report, every moment. He had not let himself examine too closely. She could see it all pressing against the surface of his composure, now like water against glass. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Clara." It was the first time. She heard her name in his mouth and felt it the way you feel the first note of a piece of music you've heard before, not surprise but recognition. "Whatever you're about to say," she said carefully, "say it with the understanding that I have nowhere else to go, and that what happens to me after this conversation is determined entirely by what you decide in it. I want you to know that I know that. And I want you to know that I'm not telling you that, so you'll feel sorry for me." She paused. "I'm telling you so that whatever you decide it, knowing the full weight of it." Julian looked at her for a long time. "I'm not going to dismiss you," he said. Clara let out a slow breath. "But I need to understand something." He leaned forward slightly. "Why are you still here? Not the answer you'd give to a question in a drawing room. The real one." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Because Eleanor told me her mother used to read to her at night," she said. And she said it like something she was confessing, like it was embarrassing to miss it, like she'd been taught not by anyone's words, but by the shape of everything around her, that needing people was something to be ashamed of. She met his eyes. "And I cannot leave a child who has been taught that and not try to undo it. I just can't." Julian said nothing. His hand was flat on the desk again. "She said one other thing," Clara said. "She said her mother used to call her Eleanor Bird. She said your wife made up a story about a bird who flew very far from home and was afraid she'd never find her way back, and the story always ended the same way the bird found her way back, because she remembered the sound of her mother singing." Clara's voice stayed steady. She was proud of that too. "She told me that story. And then she said, 'Papa doesn't know that story. He never asked.'" Julian closed his eyes. It was the most unguarded thing Clara had ever seen from him, those few seconds. With his eyes closed, his hand pressed flat on the desk, his composure simply and completely set aside. "I didn't ask," he said. "No," Clara said. "Because if I asked about the stories..." He stopped. His throat moved. "If I asked what she remembered about her mother, then I would have to hear it. All of it. And I don't..." He stopped again. "I know," Clara said. "I don't know how to..." "I know," she said again, quieter. "But Eleanor is waiting. She has been waiting for 2 years, and she will wait as long as you need, because she loves you and children love their fathers, even when it's hard. But she is 7 years old, and grief does not wait for us to be ready, Mr. Hartwell. It just keeps living in the space we leave for it." He opened his eyes. He looked at her. In 23 years of her life, Clara had been looked at in many ways. She had been looked at with approval and with judgment, and with the particular dismissive assessment of people who decide quickly who you are and stop paying attention. She had never been looked at the way Julian Hartwell looked at her in that moment, like she was something he was trying to understand, and couldn't, something that did not fit inside any category he had previously prepared. "What do you want from me?" he asked. And the question was genuine, stripped of all the defensive armor, the authority, the careful controlled distance. Just a man asking a real question. "I want you to ask Eleanor about the story," Clara said. "Tonight, after supper. I want you to go to her room and sit down and ask her to tell you about the Eleanor Bird." The silence held. "And then," Clara said, "I want you to tell her something about her mother. Something you know that she doesn't. Something that belongs to her." Julian was very still. "She needs a piece of her mother that comes from you," Clara said. "Not a portrait, not a formal memory, a real one. Something small. Something that shows her that you loved Margaret too, and that you're not afraid to say her name." Julian pressed his hand flat on the desk. He pressed it so hard his knuckles went pale. "I am afraid," he said so quietly, she almost didn't catch it. "I know you are," Clara said. "Do it anyway." Yow, she did not know what happened that evening. She ate supper in the kitchen with Mrs. Beaumont and Dottie and George, because Julian had asked in the politest possible phrasing for a quiet family supper, and she understood what that meant. And she went without protest, and Dottie gave her extra biscuits, which was Dottie's language for, "I'm sorry," and also, "I'm proud of you." And Mrs. Beaumont refilled her tea without comment. Clara sat at the kitchen table and ate her supper, and did not allow herself to wonder too specifically what was happening in the dining room above. But later, much later, after the house had gone quiet, and the summer dark had settled fully in, she was sitting at her desk with her father's Bible when she heard footsteps in the corridor. They stopped outside her door. She waited. A knock. Light. Uncertain. She opened the door. Eleanor was standing in the hallway in her nightgown, with her dark curls loose, and her feet bare on the floorboards, and her gray eyes were red-rimmed and very bright, and she had clearly been crying. Not the broken kind of crying, but the other kind, the releasing kind, the kind that comes after something hard and leaves you lighter. "He knew the story," Eleanor said. Her voice was unsteady and wondering. "He knew the Eleanor Bird story. He knew the whole thing." Clara looked at her. "He said Mama used to tell it to him too," Eleanor said. "He said she made up a different ending for each of them, his ending and my ending." She pressed her fist against her mouth for a moment. "He told me his ending. He said he'd never told anyone." Clara didn't trust her voice. She nodded. "He cried," Eleanor said, and the wonder in her voice was immense. A 7-year-old confronting the information that fathers cry, that this father cried, that grief was something that lived in him too, and not just in her. "He didn't make a sound, but his face—" She stopped. "He held my hand the whole time." "Good," Clara managed. Eleanor looked at her. "Did you tell him to—" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I told him you were waiting," she said. "The rest was him." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment with those old young eyes. Then she crossed the threshold and put her arms around Clara's waist, and pressed her face against her shoulder, and Clara put her hand on the back of the girl's head and held her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "He said you could stay," Eleanor said into her shoulder. Clara closed her eyes. "He said it was my house too," Eleanor said, "and you could stay as long as I wanted." Clara held her tighter. "I want forever," Eleanor said very quietly and very plainly, the way 7-year-olds say enormous things. Clara pressed her cheek against Eleanor's hair and breathed, and did not make any promises she wasn't certain she could keep, because she had learned from this house that promises are the architecture of trust, and trust is built slowly and with great care and cannot be rushed. But she did not let go. And in the study, at the end of the hall, behind a closed door, Julian Hartwell sat alone for the first time in 2 years, and wept for his wife without shame. And the house around him held the sound of it, the way good houses hold the hardest things quietly, and without judgment, and with something that felt against all reason, like hope. The morning after Eleanor stood in Clara's doorway and said, "I want forever," the house woke up different. Clara felt it before she understood it, the way the air in a room changes after a storm has finally broken that particular stillness that isn't emptiness, but relief. She came downstairs to find Mrs. Beaumont already in the kitchen, same as always. But when Clara appeared in the doorway, the older woman looked at her and said plainly and without ceremony, "He was up before 5. He rode out at first light and came back an hour later, and he had mud on his boots, and he was humming." Clara stopped. "Humming? I haven't heard that man hum in 2 years," Mrs. Beaumont said. She pushed the tea across the table. "So, whatever you did, Miss Ashford, don't stop." Julian came to breakfast. That was the first thing. In the 5 weeks Clara had been in this house, Julian Hartwell had never come to the family breakfast. He ate early alone before Eleanor was awake, and was in his study by the time the rest of the household gathered. It was so established a pattern that Eleanor didn't even ask about it anymore. She had stopped expecting him, the way children stop expecting things that never come. So when his footsteps came down the hall and he appeared in the breakfast room doorway, Eleanor looked up from her porridge and went completely still. Julian looked at his daughter. Something crossed his face, the old reflex of the closed door, the practiced distance, and then it moved through and past, and he sat down in the chair beside her. "Good morning," he said. Eleanor stared at him. "Good morning, Papa," she said very carefully, like she was holding something fragile. Julian picked up his coffee cup. "What are we reading today?" he said. "Crusoe finished the fence," Eleanor said. She was watching him the way you watch something you've wished for that has finally appeared, not quite trusting it yet, but unable to look away. "He's deciding whether to build a boat." "A boat," Julian said. "To go where?" "Home," Eleanor said. "Except—" She stopped. "Except what?" "Except the island has started to feel like home too," Eleanor said. "So, he doesn't know which direction to go." Julian was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That's a hard problem," he said. "Clara says sometimes home is a person, not a place," Eleanor said. She glanced at Clara, who was sitting across the table attending carefully to her own breakfast. "She says you can carry it with you." Julian also looked at Clara. Clara looked at her porridge. "That sounds right," Julian said. The letter from Mr. Alderton should have been the end of it. That was how these things worked. Clara knew that, had known it from the moment she read those 3 careful paragraphs. A man in Julian's position, with business before the county court, with the social architecture of Albemarle County, pressing its collective weight against one arrangement in his household, that kind of pressure resolved itself in a predictable direction, and the direction was not in Clara's favor. She had been waiting for it all week. Not with resignation, she was not a woman built for resignation, but with the steady readiness of someone who has decided to keep walking until the road ends. The road ended on Thursday. Not the way she expected. She was in the nursery with Eleanor going through the French recitation that Eleanor still resisted, but had begun to approach with something closer to tolerance when Mrs. Beaumont appeared at the door with the expression Clara had learned to read as significant thing incoming: "Brace yourself." "Mr. Hartwell would like to see you," she said. "In the formal study." The formal study, not the upstairs one. Clara set down her papers, told Eleanor to practice the 3rd declension, and followed Mrs. Beaumont down the stairs with her hands loose at her sides and her breathing deliberate. She opened the study door and stopped. Julian was not alone. Mr. Alderton was there. She recognized him immediately from the voice she'd heard in the corridor, that confident carrying tone that now belonged to a broad-shouldered man of 50, with a magistrate's bearing and the easy authority of someone who rarely needed to raise his voice. He was standing near the window. Julian was behind his desk. And beside the desk in the chair that was usually empty during these meetings sat Mrs. Pendleton. Clara looked at all 3 of them and understood that whatever this was, it had been arranged, and it had been arranged deliberately, and she had not been told because knowing would have changed how she walked through the door. "Miss Ashford," Julian said. "Sit down." She sat. "You know Mrs. Pendleton," Julian said. "And this is Mr. Alderton, who is—" "We've spoken," Clara said, looking at Alderton. "Through a wall, approximately." Alderton had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "Mr. Alderton has come to withdraw his letter," Julian said. Clara looked at Julian. "He came this morning." Julian continued, and his voice was measured, but underneath the measurement was something that was almost satisfaction. "Apparently Mrs. Pendleton paid him a visit yesterday afternoon, and Reverend Aldous, and 2 other gentlemen of the county whose names you don't need to know, but whose opinions Mr. Alderton values considerably." Clara looked at Mrs. Pendleton. Mrs. Pendleton looked back with the expression of a woman who considers good deeds unremarkable and is faintly impatient with being thanked for them. "I told you to hold your ground quietly," Mrs. Pendleton said. "I didn't say I'd be quiet about it." Alderton cleared his throat. "I wanted understood, Miss Ashford, that my letter was written in concern for Mr. Hartwell's professional interests, and not with any—" "I understand," Clara said. "The talk it was not something I originated." "I know where it originated," Clara said. Alderton looked at Julian. Julian looked at the desk. It was not a comfortable silence for Alderton. "The letter is withdrawn," Alderton said, formally. "You will have no difficulty in this county on account of anything I've said or written, and I have communicated as much to the relevant parties." Clara looked at Julian. "And Mrs. Drayton?" A pause. "Cecile left yesterday," Julian said. "For Richmond. She sends her regards." Clara said nothing. The politeness of it, "she sends her regards," was so thoroughly Julian that she almost wanted to smile. "Thank you," she said to Alderton. She said it plainly without excess because he had done the right thing, and that deserved acknowledgement, but not performance. He nodded and excused himself, and Mrs. Pendleton rose with him, and at the door, she turned back and looked at Clara with those measuring eyes that had Clara realized always been measuring in her direction. "You'll do," Mrs. Pendleton said. It was, Clara would think later, one of the finest things anyone had ever said to her. The study was very quiet when they left. Julian remained behind his desk. Clara remained in her chair. The letter from Alderton, the original, the withdrawn one, was sitting between them on the desk's surface, and Julian picked it up and folded it and put it in the bottom drawer, and pushed the drawer shut with a finality that felt like a period at the end of a long sentence. "I should have handled this sooner," he said. "You handled it now," Clara said. "I let it go further than I should have. I let Cecile—" He stopped, pressed his hand flat on the desk. Clara had stopped thinking of this gesture as a nervous habit and started thinking of it as the way Julian Hartwell reached for solid ground. "She has been a fixture in this house since Margaret died. She stepped in when I didn't know how to, when Eleanor needed—" He exhaled. "I owed her gratitude, and I confused it with trust." "Those are easy to confuse," Clara said. "They shouldn't be," he said. "Not for a man in my position." "A man in your position was also grieving," Clara said. "That makes everyone's judgment worse." He looked at her. "You keep doing that," he said. "What? Offering me more grace than I've given myself." He said it simply like a fact he'd recently catalogued. I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it," Clara said. "It's just true." The silence between them was different now. It had been different since the night Eleanor knocked on Clara's door. It had lost the guarded quality, the careful maintenance of professional distance, and taken on something else, something warmer and less defined and considerably more complicated. Julian looked at her. "Clara," he said. She felt it again, the recognition, the note of a piece of music, her name in his mouth. "When your employment here is when the arrangement changes." He stopped. "When I leave," she said, because she was still that woman, the one who said the direct thing. "If you leave," he said, and the correction was quiet, but absolute. "I want to know that Eleanor isn't the only reason you'd consider staying." Clara was very still. "That's a considerable thing to say, Mr. Hartwell." "Julian," he said. She looked at him. "That's a considerable thing to say, Julian." "I'm aware." He was holding her gaze with an effort. She could see not the effort of a man performing sincerity, but the effort of a man for whom sincerity requires crossing a distance he built himself and is now slowly dismantling. "I'm asking you to tell me honestly whether it's unwelcome." Clara thought about the morning she had arrived at this house with her dead father's Bible against her chest. She thought about standing in this room and saying, "Then do it," and feeling her heart hammer while her hand stayed still. She thought about Eleanor's weight against her shoulder in the corridor and the sound of Julian's footsteps coming down to breakfast and Mrs. Beaumont saying he was humming. "It's not unwelcome," she said. Julian let out a breath. "But I need you to understand something," Clara said. "I came here with nothing. I came here because I had no other choice, and I have built something in this house, not a position, not a salary, something real with your daughter and with—" She stopped, chose the next word carefully. "With you. And I will not have it undermined by the appearance of something improper, and I will not be something you keep quietly and conveniently, and I will not—" "I know," he said. "I'm not finished." He closed his mouth. "I will not be another arrangement in this house that gets reconsidered when the county court has opinions," she said. "If you are telling me that what you feel is something genuine, then I believe you because I have watched you be exactly what you are for 5 weeks, and you are not a man who dissembles. But genuine feelings require genuine decisions. Julian, and genuine decisions in your position have consequences for both of us, and I need to know that you understand the weight of that before you say another word." The clock ticked. Julian looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "My solicitor is in Charlottesville. I'll send for him next week." Clara stared at him. "There are arrangements," Julian said, and his voice was careful and precise in the way it got when he was certain about something and was giving it the attention it deserved, "that would protect your position in this household entirely independent of your employment. Arrangements that would answer the county's questions before they're asked." A pause. "If you were willing." Clara understood what he was saying. She understood it completely, and the understanding moved through her chest like the first breath after being underwater, necessary and shocking in its clarity. "You're not a man who makes impulsive decisions," she said. "No. You've thought about this. I have thought about very little else since the night Eleanor knocked on your door," he said. "And that is the most honest thing I have said to anyone in 2 years." Clara looked at her hands. She looked at this room, this desk, this man who had said, "I can hire 50 like you," and meant it as armor, and had ended up somehow with her sitting across from him while he said her name like it meant something. "I need time," she said. "Yes," he said immediately. "Of course." "And I need—" She stopped. "I need you to keep coming to breakfast." He blinked. Of all the things she might have said, that was not what he had prepared for. "Eleanor needs it," Clara said. "Regardless of anything else, she needs to know you're going to be at that table, that you're not going to disappear back behind the study door." She met his eyes. "That's not a condition. It's just true, and I need to know that what happened this week isn't something you do once and then undo." "It won't be undone," Julian said. "Then give me time," Clara said, "and keep coming to breakfast." She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it while she read to Eleanor, while she walked the grounds in the early morning before the household woke, while she sat with her father's Bible in her lap and talked to him in the way she had learned to talk to the dead, not expecting answers, but needing to say the words out loud to someone who had known her before all of this. "He's not an easy man, Papa." She turned the cover of the Bible in her fingers. "He's closed up and careful, and he uses silence like a weapon, and he has walls built around him that took 2 years of grief to stack that high. And he is also the man who sat down on the floor of a metaphorical space with his daughter and asked to hear about a fence. And he said my name like it mattered before he said anything else." She looked at the ceiling. You would have liked him, she thought. After a while. On the third evening, she went to Julian's upstairs study and knocked. "Come," he said. She came in. He was at his desk, not standing at the window, which she took as a good sign. Men stand at windows when they are bracing for things. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "My answer is yes," she said. "But I have terms." Something moved through his face, not surprise, and not relief exactly, but something that combined them and arrived as a kind of settling, like a thing that had been off balance coming level. "Tell me your terms," he said. "Eleanor is told nothing until she is old enough to understand what it means and to have a say in how she feels about it," Clara said. "She is not told as a fait accompli. She is part of the conversation." "Agreed." "My curriculum decisions are mine," Clara said. "You can advise. You can discuss. You cannot override without a conversation first." Agreed. And she stopped. When you disagree with me, which you will, because you disagree with everyone, and that doesn't change, you tell me directly. Not through Mrs. Beaumont. Not through a note. Not through reduced schedules or adjusted arrangements. You tell me to my face. Julian looked at her. You mean what you said to your father about honesty being more useful than manners? Yes. That goes two ways, he said. It always has, she said. He stood up from his desk. He was taller than her, same as always, and the room was small, and he looked at her with those November gray eyes that had somewhere in the past 5 weeks become something she was no longer afraid of. Something she had learned to read, the way you learn to read difficult weather, until the difficulty becomes familiar, and the familiarity becomes against all expectation, a kind of comfort. Clara, he said. Julian. He extended his hand. It was a formal gesture, the gesture of a man who had been raised to seal important things with formality, and was offering her that language because it was the one he trusted most. She looked at his hand, and she understood what he was offering, and she took it. His grip was firm and steady, and held on just a moment longer than a handshake required. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, she said. You haven't met me in an argument about the French curriculum. He almost smiled. She watched it, that almost smile. She had been watching for 5 weeks, the one that lived at the corner of his mouth and retreated before it fully arrived. This time it made it. Small and unused looking, like a room that hadn't been opened in a long time, but still had everything in the right place. I reckon I can hold my own, he said. Clara looked at him. Julian Hartwell, who ran 3,000 acres with iron precision and sat alone at windows and carried his grief like a man carrying something he couldn't put down, because he was afraid that putting it down meant forgetting, had just said, I reckon. That, she said, is the most hopeful thing you have ever said to me. Child. The last Sunday of August, the Hartwell household attended the morning service as usual. The carriage held Julian, Eleanor, and Clara, no fourth seat, occupied no careful social geometry to navigate. Eleanor sat between them, and held a wildflower she had picked from the front garden, and informed them both that she intended to press it in Robinson Crusoe when they got home. Which page? Julian asked. Eleanor thought about it. The page where he decides to stay, she said. Julian looked at Clara over Eleanor's head. Clara looked back. After the service, Reverend Aldous shook Julian's hand and nodded at Clara with the warm satisfaction of a man who has done a good thing and watched it succeed and said nothing, because some things don't require comment. Mrs. Pendleton passed Clara on the church steps and said without stopping, The county is already finding something else to talk about. These things move fast. Duh. And then she was gone, and Clara stood in the August morning with its long golden late summer light and breathed. Eleanor appeared at her side and took her hand without asking, the way children take things they have already decided belong to them. Julian appeared on her other side. Ready, he said, not a question. Clara looked at Eleanor, who was holding her wildflower and examining it with the total absorption of a child, at peace. And then she looked at Julian, who was looking at her with eyes that held for the first time since she'd walked through his door, nothing held back, and nothing calculated, and nothing withheld. Yes, Clara said. They walked to the carriage, the three of them, on that last good Sunday of the summer, and the road back to Hartwell Manor stretched open and clear, and Clara carried her father's voice in her chest. You carry it quiet, you carry it proud, and understood finally and completely that proud didn't have to mean alone. Eleanor climbed into the carriage first and settled herself with her flower, and looked up at both of them with those old young eyes, and said with the absolute certainty of a child who has decided something is true, and therefore it is, this is my favorite part, when everybody comes home. Julian handed Clara up into the carriage, and then he stepped up himself, and the door closed, and the carriage moved, and the house came into view through the trees, pale Virginia brick-white columns, the fence lines straight, and the grounds immaculate, and every window catching the August light, and it looked for the first time exactly like what it was. Not a judgment. A home. And Clara Ashford, who had come to this house with nothing but a dead man's Bible and a spine made of something harder than pride, had found exactly what she hadn't known she was looking for. Not rescue, not charity, not the cold shelter of someone else's wage. She had found a place where her name meant something, and a child who called it out like it belonged, and a man who was learning slowly and imperfectly and with great determination how to stop building fences around the things he loved. That was enough. That was everything.